What is going on, everybody? And welcome into the 40th episode of the CRZY podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates, and this is the show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and a whole host of other things that matter to creative people. I cannot believe that we are already at the 40th show. I feel like we should be driving an overpriced sports car, having some sort of like a mid-podcast crisis or something. It feels like just yesterday I started the show, and it's a little hard to believe that we're already 40 episodes in. But instead of doing something that cliche, I actually wanted to mark this occasion with a bit of an exploration of something that I think is a really important topic that's facing creatives today. And it came out of the fact that about a month ago, I was on a panel for the New York Festival's advertising competition that was called Who Owns Creativity? Now, the panel had me and two senior ad agency executives discussing that topic. And in a lot of cases, it really wanted to be the us versus them, the in-house versus the agency argument about, in this day and age, who owns creativity. Now, the thing that I really feel like is that this isn't a topic that is as simple as I think a lot of people think it is. This isn't just an in-house versus an agency team. I wanted to spend this episode discussing this topic in a bit more depth. And as usual, we're going to kind of break it down into, probably about 4 parts. I think the first one that I want to do is just look at the basics of both sides. Because one of the things that I've found is that at this point in my career, I've spent equal amounts of time working on the agency side as I have on the in-house side. Probably even at this point, a little bit more on the agency side. In a lot of cases, I feel like the one side doesn't necessarily think about or appreciate the other side. So I just want to go through the basics of that. Then let's just take a minute and look at the pros and cons of both of those sides. I want to then talk about kind of just fundamentally what I think is leading to this debate. It's really probably a different way of working that's driving this discussion, this debate, this ongoing shift in what's going on in this sort of like commercial creativity. And then finally just have a bit of a discussion about where as an industry do we go from here? Now, I know that in a lot of cases, episodes that tend to focus on things that you can do as an individual tend to be the more popular ones. But this is one of those ones that I really think is important to listen to because this affects all of us. If you are a creative for money, this affects you. And that we're all need to be a part of this discussion. We all need to be a part of where this is going. That if we just sit around and kind of go, look, this is somebody else's problem, well, that's where we all get into problems. We're going to run through those 4 things and really just kind of take a look at this question of, in this day and age, who really does own creativity? Now, let's start with the basics, because that's always the easiest place to start. Because like I said, I've spent equal time on the agency side and on the in-house side. And, even now that I'm running an in-house team, I still work with a lot of different ad agencies. So I still very much am connected to that world, very much connected to the way that they work. And I work with ones from some of the biggest mega holding companies in the world to a few more kind of independent shops. This is one of those things where I'm not someone who makes assumptions about one side or the other. What we really are seeing here is that over the past 10 years, there's been a shift in the industry. And it's been a shift where we've started to really see the rise of in-house creative teams. They continue to grow. That whenever I first started out in advertising, there were very, very few companies that actually had really quality in-house teams. These would be the Nikes, the Apples, the companies like that those were the only ones that really had in-house teams. Now you're starting to see it in a much different place, in a much different scale. And as a result, that dynamic between companies or companies with in-house design teams and agencies is changing. Let's start by, like I said, let's just look at the basics of each side of this conversation. One of the things that is the great part about agencies, especially if you're creative, is that being creative is the heart of the house. It's the reason for being. You are the very center and the fuel that drives the engine. That's really what you're selling. You're selling ideas. You're selling that creativity. That is very clearly the product of an agency. Now, for an in-house team, and I think that this was something that I had to kind of wrap my head around a little bit when I first went to Starwood, is that a creative team or a design team is important, but it is not the main product of the company. Whenever I was with Starwood, the main product was putting heads in beds. design is not the leading product. But it's like I said, it doesn't mean that it's not important, but it just has a different position, a different orientation inside of the company. Now, like you said before, the focus of an agency is really on ideation, because that's really what they want to do. Is they want to come in, they want to have a lot of really good ideas, a big variety of ideas, work on a variety of clients, and that's a real strength of theirs. The difference with the in-house team is that here again, you want to focus on ideation just as much, but the interesting component that often comes with it is that in many cases, you are responsible for seeing it from ideation all the way through to launch, and you are also then responsible for living with that idea. And I think that in a lot of cases in agencies, they can come up with the idea and then hand it off to have it built. They may come up with the idea, and maybe they actually even do see it all the way through production. But they don't have to live with it the same way because it's a different company. They aren't held responsible for the actual financial results of something like an app or an ad campaign, or they can be in the way that they may be able to be fired, but you just relate to something differently whenever there's that couple degrees of separation. And it's like I said before, agencies are all about variety. They have a lot of different clients. That was one of the things I love and quite candidly really miss about the agency side of things, is the fact that you get to work on an airline or an automotive account or an insurance company or a casino but there's a huge variety that you can work through, and it really lets you be able to kind of develop that ability to empathize and see through the eyes of a lot of different consumers. Now, from the in-house side, it really is about ownership, brand ownership, product ownership, and I think that was what led me from the agency side to the client side part of the work, was because I had clients like American Airlines that I'd worked on, and I had them as a client that I was working on when September 11th happened. And so then we spent the subsequent years working with them to keep them out of bankruptcy. And that really led me to the place of realizing that building a brand and building a product was so much more of an interesting challenge to me than just building an ad for that brand. And so that for me, the ownership piece of it was really what drew me to the in-house side, because I could be closer to the executives. I could be closer to the decisions. I could have a different impact than, again, when I had that few degrees of separation whenever I was in an agency. Now, that's just the basics of kind of the two different sides of that. But let's scratch below that surface a little bit more and look at a few more of the pros and cons of each of these. And really, let's expand on those basics. And let's just, I don't know, it feels like a good number. Let's pick 5 for each side. Let's do 5 pros and cons of agencies, 5 pros and cons for in-house. And since I'm in-house now, let's start there because it probably is the easiest for me. Now, I think that one of the biggest things that an in-house team has going for it is that, well, it seems obvious enough, they are in-house. And that means that they have a cultural connection to the work and to the company. And because of that, you are a part of the company. You are viewed differently than when you are at an agency. That if I, as the head of design versus a head of design for an agency, say the exact same thing, it is heard internally differently because they feel like since I'm a part of the company, I have a bit more of a vested interest in that decision. Now, the con of being inside of the company is that you have to work to keep perspective. You have to work to stay fresh, because this is the one thing that I see is you can start to lose the forest for the trees after a while, because you don't have that variety. You don't have the objectivity that comes with that few degrees of separation, and that can be a challenge for some people. The extension of that, like I said, is because you really are part of the culture, is that you live the company's problems. There's a depth of understanding there because that is what you do day in and day out. And that can be an incredibly powerful thing. But the con of that is that you can also start to use that as an excuse for why things can't be done, because you are a part of that culture. You could drink the Kool-Aid. You can get accustomed to all the excuses for why stuff can't get done. And that really can be a challenge. The third thing about this is that you do then end up with a dedicated team. And that means that these are people who know that this is really something that they own. This goes back to the ownership that we had talked about before, that this is something that you are dedicated to. This is something that you own. You have a stake in. But here again, the flip side of that is that if you don't try to stay hungry, if you don't stay aware of that, being dedicated can mean that you become complacent. because you can just become a little bit too indoctrinated to the problems, to the excuses, to why things can't get done, and you just kind of start to lose the edge, and you lose the drive. It's why in so many cases, whenever I've run internal teams, I always like to describe them as an in-house agency with a client who just can't fire me. Now, the reason why I describe that is because I think what you have to keep is the drive, is the edge that agencies have. Because at the end of the day, agencies have that inherent threat that they know if they do bad work, if the client isn't happy, they're going to get fired. That creates a sense of urgency. It creates a focus that allows them to really dial in on making sure that they're doing the best work that they can. Well, on the in-house side, you don't have that. That it can be that maybe you personally can get fired, but if they're investing in this team, it means that you can then, by extension, become complacent. Now, the fourth thing that I think in-house teams have going for them is sometimes, and I will categorize this as sometimes, and look, this is in general not meant to be this kind of like all or nothing sort of a thing. I never believe that all of anything is true. All men don't do something, all women don't do something, all in-house teams don't do something, all agencies don't do something. It's never all. So all of this stuff is just meant to be things that are really said as sometimes. But the fourth thing is that sometimes cost can really become an issue. Because in general, in my experience, and whenever you look at it on a head-by-head basis, in-house teams are cheaper because they aren't carrying the overhead that agencies are, and they aren't carrying a lot of the other expense. The con of that is that they are a full-time expense. So that means that you have to be careful and diligent about how and where you put those heads, because if you get too big and if you get too bloated, it is something that can easily then get cut, because it's a dedicated part of what this is. So you have to kind of, again, keep that agency mindset, try to be a little bit nimble with it, but again, know that you can use that to your advantage as an in-house, that in general, if you invest in the in-house team, it's going to save us money. Now, the fifth one, and this one, again, is a sometimes one, is speed. Because whenever I have dedicated in-house resources, they can start right away. They're already ramped up on the problem. They're already briefed on our brand. They already understand our systems and our structures, so I can get them up and running much faster than in many cases I can with an agency, unless I have a dedicated team there. And we'll talk about speed when we get to the agency side here in a second. But the con here is that for an in-house team, it oftentimes is then hard to flex your capacity. How do I scale up and down if my pipeline of work flexes? Because in many cases, I'm tied to dedicated headcount. And that means I oftentimes can't get new heads, whether they're freelancers or whether they're full-time, approved quickly. So that unless I'm actively working through this problem, speed can actually work against me as well. Those are the five, like I said, that would just be, for me, the top line thoughts around pros and cons for in-house teams. Now, let's talk about the agency side of this. From the agency side, and we already hit on this a little bit, the first one, and probably the biggest one, is that agencies bring a fresh perspective and inspiration. Because that's the thing. They're always looking for new ideas and new perspectives because they're used to that variety. You're used to thinking on your feet. There are often cases whenever I talk to those teams plugged into a much wider base of culture and of inspiration because they don't get tunnel visioned in on whatever it is they work on. Whenever I had teams at Star Wars, they tend to get very focused on what was other hotel competition doing. At Citi, you tend to get very focused on, well, what's the other bank competition doing? Don't get me wrong, that's definitely important. But a lot of times if you want to find something new, if you want to find something innovative, you've got to look past that. You have to take it from a wider set of inspirations. And I think agencies do that really, really well. But it's like I said, is that the con of that is that there isn't a whole lot of ownership really past the ideation phase over time, because that tends to be the main part that they focus on, is having the idea. Then the fidelity of that execution, or kind of having to live with it, well, that's not necessarily something that they always have to do. Now, the next piece of this, and this really comes hand in hand with that fresh perspective and inspiration, really is that agencies have a fantastic depth of experience. And this comes from the fact that they're working across a lot of different industries, a lot of different mediums, so that it may be that there's a booking flow or a checkout flow that I did whenever I was part of an airline. Well, then I could bring that to work on a hotel, or maybe even to a bank, or to anything like that. because I've seen a best practice. I've seen something or an inspiration from a different industry or from a different medium that I can then bring across and bring that experience in. And here again, I think that the ability to look across many different things, the ability to work on a lot of different work really is a huge advantage because it allows you to have just a different reference and skill set to be able to do these things. And it's something that, as somebody that's now gone in-house, that's something I really fight to try to keep. And it's hard because people want you to just focus in on the one thing that you do. But this is why I'm into a ton of different stuff, into art, into street art, into fashion, into movies, into photography, into podcasting, like a bunch of this other stuff, because it forces me to keep that perspective open. But the con here is that, and this is what we talked about, again, a little bit before, is that breadth a lot of times doesn't necessarily breed depth. That it may be something that I have, an understanding of an airline industry or a hotel industry or a bank or something like that, but I'm not working in it day in and day out. So I don't really have the depth of experience of really understanding the deep part of the problems to really be able to generate deep ideas that can then change the business. I think this is why you've seen really that kind of new breed of agencies evolve, the ones that have come out of the consulting models, the Deloitte Digitals, the things like that, or you've seen the IDEOs or the SY Partners or places like that really look to bridge that middle ground between not just being the ideation people, but then how can they also come in with processes, with ways of thinking, with research, so they can have a deeper understanding of really where that is. Now, the third one for agencies, again, it goes to breadth, is the fact that in many cases they have a much broader skill set. And they have the ability to much more easily work on different applications, different technologies, to really be able to kind of pivot and try things much faster and much more easily because, again, that's really part of the ideation process. And as ideation, you're trying to, in part, sell the new. What's been different? What's new? What's going on? How can I tell my clients or other people about what the trends are that are going on out there? So they tend to be much more engaged, much more active in a lot of those spaces and really looking at what's going on. The con to that I've found is that in many cases, it tends to be a superficial understanding of that. They may come to me and to talk about virtual reality or augmented reality or chatbots or a lot of these other things, but whenever I then press them on tangible experience, whenever I press them on more of the fine detail of how they would design that experience, one of the things that you find is that they either learned it just enough to produce a demo, they learned it just enough because they watched a keynote, but in many cases, I may have to pay them to actually get the depth of experience because they've learned it just enough to talk about it convincingly. Here again, the places that are the middle grounds, they oftentimes will do a better job with this and to take a bit of a deeper look into some of these things. It's that breadth versus depth sort of a conversation. The fourth thing that I think agencies do really well is that they honestly have much better budget flexibility. Because this comes really from a lot of different things. One is that in many cases, they have a much deeper bench of talent that allows them to bring big teams or small teams. It allows them to be able to do things more quickly, or it allows them to be able to just kind of play with the numbers a bit more than what internal teams can. Because internal teams so often really are much more burdened by process or by regulation or by other things because of the way the company works. And that, because of that, in many cases, they don't have that same sort of budget flexibility, and maybe even, and we'll get to this here in a second, some of the speed that an agency would have. The problem that comes with that budget flexibility is the fact that in many cases I may get speed, but maybe I'm not going to get depth. This is the old classic thing of if you drew a triangle and on each corner of the triangle you wrote good, fast, and cheap, and then you'd only be able to pick two of those. This is really where that came out of, is that I may get, budget flexibility, but I'm not going to get good work. And so again, there's always a trade-off for that is going to come with that. Now, the last thing for agencies that I think that they do really well is speed. This is one of the biggest things, even as, an in-house team, that I still look to them to do, is because of the fact that agency culture is just different. It really is the fact that they are used to working fast. They're used to working all night. They're used to doing whatever it takes to get the job done. And in many cases, as an in-house team, whenever you have those projects that come along, I can either kill my own team, but it probably is a little bit easier if I kill an agency because they're much more used to that. They're more trained to work those kind of hours. But as a result of that, though, the thing that I've seen is that they tend to have a higher turnover rate than an in-house team, because agencies do take a toll working that way. Giving up your personal life, your nights, your weekends isn't for everybody. And that's the thing, is I know a lot of people who will leave agencies to come in-house because they want a better work-life balance. I also know a lot of very, very successful creatives who, really have chosen that, and as a result are on their third or fourth marriage. And look, I also know some that are more willing to work those hours and just have incredibly understanding spouses. But it is a trade-off, and it's a different one than a lot of times you have to make for an in-house team, because there aren't many in-house teams that are pulling all-nighters. It certainly can happen from time to time, but it's not a huge part of what goes on there. So it's like I said, this is just to lay the foundation. I think to try to give both sides a perspective on what the other one is, but to also start to set up an appreciation for the other side, that there are pros and cons to both sides of these questions, of these equations. And I wanted to start it and talk about this stuff because, for me, just that base question of who owns creativity really implies that there is an owner. But I think that what's going on here, it's not necessarily about ownership. That beneath these basic differences, there is also, quite frankly, a split in perspective and how creative teams are working with their clients. And I think that's the real discussion here, because I think if we want to strip away all this other stuff of finger pointing, name pointing, of each side thinking the other side somehow isn't as good as the other one, then I think that there's a different issue here. And it's like I said before, this isn't saying that this is true for every agency. It's not true for every in-house team, but it is true across a lot of them that I've seen. And so let's go back to that panel at New York Festivals for a second, because it was about in-house versus agency teams and who owns that relationship. And it really is kind of saying that what's underneath ownership for me, and the real topic to discuss here, is about really, how do you work with your clients? How do you choose to engage them? How do you choose to include them in your creative process? Because I think that, to me, is where the real divide is. Because that's really what is at the heart of all this, is that it's about, do I bring them in or do I keep them at arm's length? Because generally, in-house teams tend to be more inclusive with their clients. And in a lot of cases, you have to do that to be successful, because you're a part of the company. And so to be able to do that, you really have to build support for your ideas if you actually want them to launch. If you are exclusive of them, and if you just say, look, we're creative, you don't get what we do, you don't tend to get much funding. You don't tend to get a whole lot of support, and it tends to be a pretty decent battle uphill with your ideas. In-house teams generally are a bit more inclusive with their clients. And I'd also say that you also see that inclusion, honestly, because the entire idea of a product, a quote-unquote product, well, that's changed a lot over the years. Because it used to be that products were done by like specialized firms. You would never talk about a company, unless you were somehow like a packaged goods company, about having a product internally. Now we have apps and websites and all these other things that require creativity and design that are now products as well, that don't require big manufacturing machines, that don't require a lot of these big sort of things. And I think that, and the need for that inclusion, that's what's driving this resurgence that we're seeing, this rediscovery that we're seeing in things like design thinking. Because design thinking is an inclusive methodology. It's about creativity. It's about giving that creativity shape and form in a way that most anybody can plug into. That's really what's driving it, is that a lot of these teams are trying to figure out how to be inclusive. And that's a great blueprint to be able to do that. The other side of that coin, when we talk about agencies. Now, agencies generally are a bit more of the arm's length, or the exclusionary sort of thing. And I think that a lot of cases it makes sense because they are external to the company. And the thing that you see is that agencies too often see their clients as the people who stand in the way of great ideas. And this was something that I was guilty of, because there was very much a time that whenever I worked on the agency side, that you went client side when you wanted to essentially die or retire or fade into the sunset or do something like that. You didn't go to the client side to do great work. You got client side to get a better paycheck, work more reasonable hours, and to be able to just be fine kind of swallowing your pride and any career ambitions with, the fact that you wanted to do bigger things. Some of this is true. But I think that it's also that, there are a lot of clients, and we've talked about this in the past, about how do you kind of keep clients from screwing with your creative process. But I would also say that here again, it comes down to the depth and the ownership piece, that in a lot of cases, your clients just have business realities that they're accountable to. I would love to be able to do things that look different. I'd love to be able to be more creative and not have to listen to research sometimes or do a lot of those things, but there's a business reality that I am tied to that will usually kind of influence my decisions. But I think in a lot of cases, the thing that I see is that so many of these agencies, well, they have their own proprietary process to have ideas, and they like to use it to work really just kind of behind closed doors. They like to keep it a secret. They feel like it's one of those things that makes them more valuable. It's the secret sauce sort of a thing. And then they like to present those ideas back to their clients. So that's really the issue here, because I think whenever I have this discussion, that's what it really comes down to is, am I going to include my clients, or am I going to say, look, I'm the creative person. I'm the one who really gets and understands this. So as a result of that, I need to be the one who's going to go off and think and ponder, and then I will be back with a solution. We're back to where we started. Who owns creativity? And I think that the simple answer for me in this, and maybe it's not quite the answer that I think everybody wishes it was, but for me, the simple answer is that both sides still own it. But both sides need to evolve, because both sides are currently a part of the problem. Companies want more inclusive models. They want to be able to get this expertise in-house. They want agencies to invest. Because what they're really looking for, talked about this in other episodes, is they want people who can teach them how to be creative. That's what they want. More than design, more than anything else, is creativity. And then they want those teams, internal or external, to then have the confidence, the skill, the strategy, the investment to then let those ideas go out the door and get them out the door in a form that people, quite frankly, still give a shit about. Because that's a huge problem. That's a huge part of this. I think that really is part of it, at least on the agency side, is that for me, the thing that I see is that agencies need to figure out how do they return to genuinely valuing relationships. I don't mean this in like the account guy who's going to take somebody out to lunch. I don't mean this in the hollow, pointless compliment or the sycophant suck-up sort of thing that you say, but I mean genuinely investing in the relationship between the agency and the company. Because that was the biggest thing that I saw whenever I was at Starwood. Tons of companies wanted to work with us, but so few of them were actually willing to invest in that relationship, to do something that was beyond just the basics, beyond just, okay, I'm going to get billed for every little thing. Because the reality is that when you're on the client side, and this is something that I work at every single day, is I try not to be the crappy client that I used to have that would drive me crazy. Some days I'm able to do that. Some days, because of reasons out of my control, I can't. Some days I show up with great projects that have plenty of time and plenty of money. Sometimes I show up with a crappy project that doesn't have enough money that needs to get done overnight. And I need people who can work with me through both of those, because I'm not always going to have everything that's at my own control and in my own disposal to be able to control things the best way possible. That's really part of it, though, is that in that return to the relationship, we also need to see these massive mega holding corporations understand the value of that relationship. Because the thing that I've seen time after time, heartbreakingly so, is I see these huge, massive holding corporations. They come in, they buy up these small, mid, even large size agencies. And then the routine is inevitably the same. That the account people who were such great partners suddenly are talking about the pressure that they're under to get their billings up. That all of a sudden the rate card starts going up. The quality of the work starts going down. And that ultimately they don't respect the relationship with us anymore, and they just start to look at us as dollar signs. Well, then, if that's the case, then we start to look at them instead of as a partner, but as a vendor. That's really the problem, is that whenever that comes down to that relationship, it's not about trust. It's not about any sort of relationship anymore. It's where each side is constantly doubting the other one. That was what I think really also led to the rise in in-house design teams, was because there were too many companies that suddenly very much became aware of the fact that they were just a dollar sign to too many agencies. And what they started to see was that if they used internal resources, in many cases they could be just as good as their agency. They could get it for less money. And they started to see studies that were being done by Fortune magazine and others that really would look at the companies who over-indexed on design. Now, the one in particular that everyone tends to reference included the team that I helped to run at Starwood, that those teams over a 10-year span, they were 110% more profitable than companies who didn't on the S&P 500. But that was the thing, is you started to see, look, if they're just going to look at me as a dollar sign, if the quality of the work isn't going to be as good, and I can invest in these people who will be here every day, they're going to live and breathe and die on our problems, they're going to be able to look at this stuff a little bit more deeply than what an agency could. That why wouldn't we start to invest in those things? It suddenly becomes a decently easy argument to make. That's been a bit of the problem, because of the fact that it has been easy to make, because you've seen this strain or this breakdown in the relationship. You saw more and more design teams starting to rise up. Now, let's not pretend, and I'm certainly not going to pretend, like just because I'm client side, that those companies get a free pass, because they absolutely do not. They've got work that they need to do too, because they need to do a lot of things. One is them to realize that they need agencies. You need a fresh perspective. You need a broader skill set. You need people who are looking at things differently. I always will want that. I'll always need to bring that in, because I'm so incredibly aware that I may start to lose that perspective, lose the forest for the trees. But I also need to bring them up and set them up to succeed. I need to let them do their work. I need to stop holding them back. I need to stop giving them crappy briefs and giving them problems to be, really those solutions to be vetted, not those problems to be solved. Because that's the problem that I see so many times, are great agencies that just get beaten into submission because of the fact that time and time again, the more creative stuff, more of the right solution isn't really what they're producing. It's a very simple test. Have a one-on-one conversation with the person at your agency who you think is most likely to tell you the truth. Pull them aside after a meeting, just the two of you. Tell them there are going to be no repercussions, but you need an honest answer. And ask them, are they doing work that they're proud of? It's a very, very simple answer. It is a very, very simple question. It is one that I think in-house and agency teams do not ask nearly enough, because they don't want the answer to it. But pull them aside and ask them, is what it is that we're asking you to do. Are we setting you up to be successful? And are you proud of the work that's coming out of it? And listen to what they say. Because the thing that I find is that these people who are all smiles, who are all spin, who are all great in all these meetings, when you pull them aside and when you say, look, guys, are you really proud of this work? They go, oh, God, no. But you know what? We need to get paid. We need to keep this thing going. So what we're going to do is we're going to give them that work. But no, this is absolutely not what they should be doing. This is the dumbest thing possible. And that's the problem, is that we default to the easier thing. We default to that sort of a thing, because that's the problem. And I said this before. We need agencies that are partners, not just vendors. Because if you treat them like a vendor, then that's the relationship that you get. If you treat them like a vendor, that's the work that you get. And quite frankly, it's the work that you deserve, because you don't trust them. And that's a huge problem. Because that's the real lesson here, I think, is that both sides need each other. Both sides have to have each other. But they have to take the time to understand each other. Yes, there are differences in approach and a lot of other things. Yes, in-house tends to be more inclusive. Yes, external agencies tend to be more exclusive. But each side needs to learn from the other, because the best agencies that I have ever worked with, they have the confidence to open the kimono, to let you in, to let you be a part of the process, to not fear that, to not think that, oh, well, then they're going to see that we don't have the answer right from the beginning. Because if you're working with a client who thinks that, you're working with a client who doesn't understand what they're asking. Creativity is not about having the right answer. It's about having a lot of wrong answers on the way to the right answer. And this is where we're getting it wrong. Because agencies don't understand how companies are changing and how they need to work with them. That it is about being more trusting, about being more open, about making it a relationship. They need better models for working with in-house teams and not just competing against them. Because that was the thing that I saw very much firsthand, was that a year and a half ago, whenever I had left Starwood and I was going out there and I was interviewing, I talked with a lot of the biggest agencies that are out there, digital and traditional. And one of the questions I would ask them is I would say, can you tell me, how are you working with in-house teams? What's your plan for how you're going to be able to do that better? 100% of the time, I got crickets and blank stares. And that is terrifying. Because things are changing. They need better models. You need to not be in this place where it's us versus them. Because that's the one thing that I can tell you, is that whenever we're doing that, whenever we're competing against each other, both sides lose. Because if an in-house team and an agency team are competing against each other, if they aren't working together, one side may win, but the other side is going to lose. And in that reality, both sides lose because the role of design and the role of creativity in that company is hurt. Because now there's a division, there's a split opinion. They aren't working together because there's so much more strength in doing that. And I know that we live in an era that everybody wants one side or the other. This is every discussion on religion. Lord knows it's every discussion on politics, where whatever the one side said, the other side absolutely has to disagree with categorically without even hearing what it is. But this is one of those places where if we want to make inroads here, if we want to grow, commercial creativity, which means creativity for money, not fine art, but if you want to get paid to be creative, it has to be about partnership. Both sides need each other. Both sides need to understand this, that it's one of those things where the in-house team, they need to act a bit more like an agency. They need that sense of urgency. They need to be able to actually go out and to be more aggressive, to act more like an internal agency. There's a lot that agencies do that they could learn from. And the agencies, they can learn a lot about partnership, about depth of understanding, about going in and really being a part of a business, and doing things that a lot of the in-house teams are doing really well, about being more inclusive and including your clients in the ideation and creative process. But that's the thing, is that each side can learn from the other. But what it takes is it takes all of us setting our egos aside and just having a conversation, because there is such a massive amount of shared ground here. We shouldn't need to be competing for work. It shouldn't be an us versus them, because the in-house teams are going to continue to grow, and agencies aren't going away anytime soon. So this is a reality that faces this industry. It's a reality that we have to start dealing with. And it can't be who owns creativity, who owns design, because there's not a single answer to that. And if there is, it's not going to work out well for either side. Like I said, I know this was a little bit of a different exploration than what we usually do, but it's just such an important topic that I keep coming back to time and time again in the discussions that I have. And as I go and talk at different companies, as I go and talk at different agencies, this core piece of it underneath, people just don't seem to understand and want to deal with. So hopefully you like the show. Hopefully you continue to find this valuable. If you do, if you find yourself ever having written something down, having recommended the show to a friend, please take a minute, go over to iTunes, go over to your favorite podcast platform, and leave a review. If you're feeling like you just have a couple seconds, go click the stars on iTunes. How much work is that? If you're feeling a little bit more robust, go in, write a sentence or two, because it really does help. Because for me, it is about trying to affect the industry. It's about trying to help share what it is that we're doing with people so that we all can get to a better place. And that happens, not surprisingly, through reviews. As always, if you want to find out more about the podcast, if you want to get the show notes because you've been scribbling furiously, maybe you missed a few things, you can always head over to podcast.stephengates.com. I continue to do a lot of work about the show notes. You can listen to other episodes, see related articles for any of these shows, do all of that stuff. If you have a question, if you agree about what I've talked about today, if you absolutely think I am full of it and I do not know what I'm talking about, it's a conversation that I want to have, and the place that we've been having that is over on Facebook. If you go to Facebook, type in the CRZY One Podcast, give that page a like. There are people every week who are on there asking questions. I'm putting up interesting articles and other things whenever I find them. Every Friday, I publish my weekly inspirations, which are the best articles and things that I've seen for that week, but that's the place to have that conversation in a forum where we all can participate. As always, the boys who are down in legal want me to remind you that all the views here are my own. They don't represent any of my current or former employers. These are all just my opinions. And finally, I say it every time because I mean it every time, but thank you for your time. I know that time is truly the only real luxury that any of us have, and I'm always incredibly humbled that you want to spend any of it with me. So thanks for the time, and as always, stay crazy.